Welcome back, Black Sheep, this serpent. So I got another history lesson for you here with our good friend Foxtrot. Welcome back.
Hey, yeah, I mean, this is going to be really interesting, especially with the newsletter that just came out from DCS about the Mariana's 1944 map. So let's dive into some of the changes or some of the comparisons with the modern Mariana's map and what we'll probably get, or what we will be getting in the 1944 version of the map.
Yeah, we know this is a work in progress imagery, so there may be changes along the way. So we'll see what happens. So we got
Yeah,
Saipan International here.
yep. So this is Saipan, and the field was called Aslito Airfield in 1944. So the Americans had this airfield prior to the Japanese occupation of the island, and then obviously during the invasion in 1944 was able to retake the field. So Eslito, or the South Airfield of Saipan, was probably one of the more central airfields in the entire Marianas string of islands. Now, in the modern day Marianas map, we've been using Guam as the primary location for takeoff and landing and major launch operations because that's where we have the most airfields. But during this time in 1944, Saipan is probably the more localized airfield that a lot of operations occurred. You had B-29s, B-25s, even flying the P-47, the Thunderbolt.
Right, which is great because we've been practicing with the 47 for 2 years now for this operation. So this is going to be really cool.
Right. So having the P-47 here, especially during the first phase of the invasion of Saipan, was towards the end, like somewhere around in June. They started developing the airfield just before the northern end of the island was taken. They actually started shipping over P-47s and launching attacks from the airfield that had already been repaved and cleaned up after the bombing missions that they already did to ruin the Japanese Air Force that was here on the island. So they actually used P-47s as an operational aircraft to attack and continue the invasion and final conquering of Saipan.
Yeah, really cool. So there's that image, and we'll go on to the next angle for the same airfield.
Right, and particularly with this angle, we get the west end of the airfield now, so you get to see a little bit more of it. We don't get to really see the staging area where you would actually see a lot of the aircraft and the airfield staged in on the north end of the airfield itself. But from this angle, at least, you can also start to see a little bit of a difference in the topography in how the modern day Mariana's map has a lot more, of course, has a lot more infrastructure, but a lot more trees. Not
Right.
so much as the agricultural end that we see from the 1944 map.
Right. It also looks like the main runway was probably angled slightly different from the modern map as well, by the looks of it.
Right, slightly angled and actually a lot wider.
Yeah, a lot
So that'll
wider.
actually be, yeah, that'll be an interesting thing. If you've already played on the Normandy map, or even the channel, you'll notice that that's a very World War II thing to have is a much
Hmm.
wider runway than we do now where it's very narrow.
Right.
The other thing about this photo here, especially, is at the bottom right, you'll see the beach landing area. So this is where phase one of the invasion of Saipan occurred, was on this particular beach. So we do get a good preview of what that beach will look like because in the modern day Marianas version, you have a lot of sprawling city that's right along that coastline. So there's not much of a beach to play with to do a full invasion landing. But in this case, especially for the time period and for what most people will probably be wanting to recreate the day of Saipan's invasion, you'll get this beach to land those Higgins boats on. And then also, because there's enough public information out there that you can actually either find, download in archives or video footage or other YouTube videos that people have made about the invasion of Saipan or even the whole Marianas campaign as a whole, you'll get a lot of different ways to be able to build out the invasion or even build out as accurately as you want it to do a very accurate invasion of Saipan.
Which is kind of our hopes and dreams here.
Right. I mean, I've already done the research on my own just because obviously World War II is my passion and interest, especially the Pacific. So having all that information and now getting to implement it into an actual World War II map and even be able to be a part of it and play it is such a really cool thing to take it from text and history books to almost practically applying all the techniques and tools that we can use nowadays in DCS.
Yeah, it's gonna be really cool. I mean, and like you said, the difference in the between the agricultural heavy imagery that you see on the World War II map versus the modern with all the trees and everything's overgrown. It's going to be really interesting to see how that plays into how we move units around the map and things like that. Because otherwise, with DCS, like you hide stuff in trees, they can shoot you, but you really can't hit them. So it's going to be fun.
Right,
Let's go on to the next
right.
one here.
Yeah, and
North
then
Saipan.
speaking of the next one, this is North Saipan and the Northern Airfield, which was primarily used by the Japanese. The U.S. Army or the Navy didn't really have a purpose for using it. Also, possibly because they bombed the heck out of it and just left it in ruins. But this was, of course, towards the latter end of the invasion in the end of June, when they finally conquered the northern end of Saipan. So this is some of the changes that you'll start to really notice is that the airfields are no longer in the same places, but we'll get a different variety of airports. And that's why I said too earlier about how Saipan will now be more of the central locale of airfield operations rather than Guam because of the difference in how those fields were used and operated from.
Right.
And once we get to Guam, which we will here in a second because that's the second phase of the Mariana's operations, is how different it will look, especially because we're not using modern assets.
Yeah, for sure. So we got one Pat here.
So Wanpat is a central airfield in Guam, and the airfield that was here before, obviously, it was just a dirt runway with a lot of localized spots for aircraft to go and taxi over to the runway and take off from. So this is one of the larger airfields that was operated by the Japanese. The U.S. didn't really have a purpose to utilize this particular airport. More further south for the Navy and the Marine Corps used Oroti and the harbor as their primary location for launches, takeoffs, and landings, and fighter operations around the islands. The Army eventually decided to go further north to Northwest Field, and unfortunately, in 1944, because this is phase two, and phase two in Guam didn't end until August, so they didn't have a means to build the airfields that they wanted to in 1944. They postponed that, of course, until after December of 44 and into January and February of 45 before they started building Northwest Airfield to launch their B-29s to attack the Japanese mainland.
Right, which is where we've
So
been operating out of for the last 2 years, pretty much on the server.
right, and primarily I would say because it has as part of the modern day Mariana's map, it's the closest thing we have to what would have been airfield operations at the time,
Right.
given the size and the scale and everything of that nature, and not being a fully fledged out runway and taxiways and things of that nature.
Yeah, exactly. It's worked out well for us. We got used to the real tight between the trees there, which these giant wide runways is going to be a really nice change of pace.
Right. Yeah.
All right, let's go on to
So
the next one here. Anderson.
yep, and obviously Anderson wasn't here at the moment, but unfortunately with this image we don't get a lot of progress view to see how much has really been developed on
Right.
the northern end of Guam. But at the time there wasn't really much anyways. So there wasn't much to look at in the first place because there were no airfields about in the northern end of Guam. In 1945, of course, that changed when Northwest was being developed, but during the 1944 campaign of the Marianas, there was nothing up here. It was mainly just a battleground for field operations that were pushing north to conquer the entire island. And in the case of Guam, some of the reports even said that there was nothing south of Oroti on Guam. So there was nothing in the southern end of Guam that was worth taking. They didn't really meet any opposition. They met more of the opposition from the Japanese north of Guam. So these had strategic positions located, but they were mainly for ground operations than they were for airfield operations.
Right. So get your air to ground practice in up here for sure.
Definitely.
Yeah. There's
So in
Northwest.
phase three, we have Northwest
Oh,
or
Northfield.
Northfield.
Yeah,
Yes.
that was my
So we
fault.
have Northfield. No problem. I mean, we're so used to Northwest, so we're used to saying so.
Yes.
But for Tinian, this is phase three, the final phase in the operations of the Marianas, and we can very clearly see the difference between the overgrowth of forest trees on the modern day Marianas map versus the very agricultural and very well developed land that was in 1944, especially for the region.
Yeah, that's
So there's a
wild
very
seeing the difference there, and that'll be a huge difference for using ground units because otherwise they're just hiding in the trees and the AI can shoot you, but you can't really shoot them. But at least with this, we have much like what we have on the Normandy map, where there's a lot of farm fields and things like that, where we can have troops moving between that you can actually target, which is gonna be really nice.
right. Yeah. So this is definitely going to provide a very unique experience in comparison to what we've already been receiving from the modern day Marianas map. So it'll give us a different perspective, and even from the agricultural side, I would say it's very well compared to the Normandy map or the Channel map,
Right.
the very agricultural, sprawling, rolling hills and stuff of that nature. You get a lot of agriculture in open areas than you would have expected from, say, island hopping campaigns with a lot of trees. It's very, very open.
Right. And another wide runway.
Yes, definitely.
All right, let's go to the next one here.
So this is looking north of the same field, North Field here. So you get the south end of the or the south runway that we didn't get a picture of in the first one we just looked at. So we get that little bit of an extra runway there, and again, seeing the difference between the number of trees and the overgrowth in the modern day versus the very agricultural and open areas on the 1944 map. Very apparent.
Definitely. Yeah, very much so. And it should help performance on the map too, I would assume.
Yeah, definitely. So the other thing, we don't have any pictures of Rhoda and what Rhoda looked like in 1944, but Rhoda actually wasn't part of the main phases of the Marianas campaign, but the Marine Corps and the Corsairs flying out of Arodi had multiple operations that were carried out on Rhoda. Rhoda was one of the islands that was being bombarded post invasion, so post phase three, which is Tinian. So they would attack Rhoda. And there wasn't a lot to report. I've read a couple of the reports from VMF 255, if I remember correctly, that reported about bombarding the island, and they said they met very little resistance and they never really lost anybody in the operations. But they did meet some resistance. There were anti-aircraft. There were some aircraft and fighters that were taking off from Rhoda. So there were operations that still occurred in the Marianas campaign as a whole, but not in the grand scale of the invasion as we know it from 1944.
Right. Very cool. And last but not least, old Pagan Airstrip.
Yep, Little Pagan Airstrip. So, I mean, the major difference here is instead of a grass runway, you have that dirt runway now.
You can tell where it's
So,
at.
yeah, you can actually see it this time instead of just trying to land out in the middle of the field. Try not to hit the island itself. So it's not really a major point in operations, especially during the Marianas campaign or specifically really anything else that occurred after the campaign itself. But it could be used as a means to as a stopping point because another operation that occurred even during the invasion was the resupply of Japanese forces and materials and that came from the north end from Iwo Jima. So a lot of the supply ships came from the north, following the chain of islands down south to Saipan to try and resupply their troops before the end of the invasion. And obviously, they didn't really succeed as well as they had hoped. We had a lot of American submarines that would attack those supply ships, and also we had a lot of American aircraft ready to take on those supply ships as well. So this could be a possible staging area for one of those locations. I'd have to do a little bit more research to really read up on how Pagan was used as a means of island hopping.
Yeah, certainly right now it's a good place to stop and get gas because there's not much else around, that's for sure.
Right? It is quite a hike. I've already done the flight before from Orodi all the way up to Pagan, and it is quite a flight to go.
Yeah, and it's a very challenging field to fly in and out of. I couldn't tell you how many times I've smacked into that hillside over there
Same.
practicing that. But well, Foxtrot, thanks for the history lesson. This is always great to get the kind of the inside knowledge of what we're expecting to create in DCS World and how have fun with it. Obviously, we want to have fun with it as well at the end of the day and make it as realistic as possible here for the squadron. So thanks again for joining us and sharing your knowledge.